Charles Darwin is known as kind of the father of evolution. And today what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of the other scientists who influenced him and kind of help him come up with the idea that life has changed on Earth. So first, there were some people who really had spent a lot of time thinking about the geology of the Earth, or just kind of what the land looked like. And some people who started questioning, did the land, how it looks today, always look that way, or had there been some changes? And so there was this idea of catastrophism that a guy named Cuvier came up with in the early 1800s. And his idea was that, he was looking at and he saw that there were natural disasters like volcano eruptions and earthquakes and storms. And his idea was that there must have been, that these natural disasters that have happened must have been able to change the Earth's surface. And that sometimes that these major changes could have caused certain species to go extinct. There was also the idea of gradualism that was developed by Hutton in the late 1700s, a little bit before Cuvier. And his idea was that if there had been not even just major changes like catastrophes, but even just small changes that happened over a really, really long period of time could all add up to big changes. And those changes could change the Earth's surface. And Lyell kind of marries these two ideas of Cuvier's and Hutton's in the mid-1800s. And his idea is this, that small changes in the past can add up to make big changes. And these changes continue even today, that the Earth is very, very old, and that the things that we see today are a result of all years and years of changes. So how did these ideas influence Darwin? Well, they made him think, there's been a lot of time for organisms to change. If the Earth is old, and if there's been lots of small changes to the Earth itself that have made big changes in Earth, then perhaps living things have had to change in response to all of these changes that have happened with how the Earth physically looked. Now, these guys were all scientists that were looking at living things instead of just the physical structure of the Earth, the life that was there. And so a guy after my own heart, a nice Swedish scientist named Carl Linnaeus, was working in the mid-1700s, and he was really just sort of looking at living things. And what he started to notice was that certain living things had characteristics in common. And he looked at organisms, and the more characteristics that in common that they had, he kind of grouped them together. And so you may have learned before about things like reptiles and amphibians and different kinds of flowering plants. And all of these categories were developed by Linnaeus, and he was the one who sort of decided that organisms have to have been changing slowly, over time. Then this guy, Buffon, in the mid-1700s, had the idea that maybe organisms that are more like if you looked at all the different kinds of monkeys that are out there, that perhaps they may have had a shared ancestor. When we say shared ancestor, we don't mean that one of those monkeys came from one of the other monkeys. We mean that maybe they might have had an ancestor in common. And then even Darwin's own grandpa, Erasmus Darwin, in the late 1700s, developed this idea that maybe more complex organisms, the ones that we see today, had developed from less complex organisms that we could see in fossils. Now, this guy, Thomas Malthus, wasn't even a scientist at all. He was a math guy. He was sort of a business guy. And his idea was that, the human population could really actually grow to be extremely big. Just even the thought that the average couple still has more than 2 children. So they're having more people born into the world every year than actually die. And his thought was, well, why didn't the human population just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger forever and ever? Well, his idea was that there's some limitations to people. Like we would run out of food. There's not always enough water and shelter, that there are diseases that kill us off. And all of these things keep the human population from increasing as much as it maybe possibly could. Now, how did all those ideas influence Darwin? Well, they made him start to think, are there other organisms that have to compete for survival besides just humans? Are bears competing for enough food and water and shelter? Are there diseases that are killing off oak trees? And also Darwin started to think, well, maybe that's true then. Maybe some organisms are dying because of these reasons. Final scientist I'd like to talk about is this guy Lamarck. Now, Lamarck is sort of one of the first people who sort of comes out and says that life for sure has changed. And his idea is that if the environment changes, organisms will have to change their traits in order to survive in response. But he's got a little bit of some goofy ideas. He thinks that organisms have this drive for perfection, which means that if they need to change their traits, they can. They want to. They want to be better. And not just humans, but all animals and plants are always striving to be the best animals and plants and bacteria that they can be. In other words, if you were to look at sort of this giraffe example, he thought that giraffes, they saw that there were leaves in the bottom of the tree that they could reach, and the giraffes in the beginning didn't maybe have as long of necks, and we could see that even just in some of the fossils that we see. And his idea was that, well, maybe they just saw the leaves towards the top of the tree and thought, well, it'd be a lot easier to survive if we could reach all the leaves on the tree. And so they kept stretching their necks longer and longer and longer until giraffes had longer necks just because they needed to have longer necks. And based on this idea, he comes up with the idea of acquired traits, was that organisms can change their own body structures. Like they could just stretch and make their necks grow longer, and they could even pass those changes on to their offspring. So if a giraffe stretched its neck really long, when it had babies, its babies would then have long necks. And he also comes up with this idea of use and disuse, which is that if you use a body part a lot, it's going to get better. It's going to get stronger. And if a body part is not used, it's going to get sort of smaller and wimpy and then maybe eventually disappear. And you may guess his ideas are kind of wrong. I shouldn't say kind of wrong. They're very wrong, right? If you decide to become a bodybuilder and you lift weights a lot and you get really, really strong, when you have kids, the bad news is they're not going to be born with huge muscles and become big bodybuilders, right? We know that you can't change your traits in that way and have them passed on. And we know just because you don't use something, it'll eventually fall off and then your kids would be born without that. That we know that not to be true. And if we look at that giraffe idea, we know that if giraffes have shorter necks, they don't get to stretch their necks. If they don't have necks long enough to reach leaves, what happens to them? They just die. Yeah, they don't get to stretch their necks just to survive. Organisms cannot change themselves if they need to survive. In fact, organisms that don't have good traits, they just die. So what about Darwin? Well, Darwin spent a lot of time on a ship called the Beagle, and he got to see a lot of things while he was on his travels. And he was really just there as a naturalist. His job, his role on that ship was to collect specimens from wherever they went and to observe them and to see what he could find out. And so what did he see when he was traveling around and visiting the Galapagos Islands? First, what he noticed in his time, and really he was, mostly alone on this trip. There were people on the ship, but they all had different jobs. And so he didn't really have a lot of time to sort of hang out and party and whatever. He was really just working and thinking by himself. And what he saw was that, he noticed lots of variation within even a single species. So if he looked at all the ducks, at first look, ducks might look all pretty similar, but when you look more closely, you might find that there are some differences in color, in height, and even just the shape of the webbing of their feet, that there were lots of variations in all organisms, whether they were plants or animals or fungus or whatever. He also saw lots of fossils, and he had a huge fossil collection when he returned from his voyage. He found that there were fossils of a lot of animals that were no longer found on Earth. We didn't see them anywhere on Earth, but there were some pretty clear fossils of them. And even though they are not found on Earth currently, that they did resemble a lot of modern animals. He also found fossils of a lot of sea creatures, of shells, of organisms that are known to only live in the ocean, high up in the mountains. And he started to think, well, why would we find fossils of dead things high up in the mountains that are from the ocean? How would they have gotten up there? He also saw that there were some characteristics that could make it easier for an organism to survive. So if you look at the example of this moth here, that's actually a specialized mouth, that big long string that looks like it's coming off of the moth. And if ones that had the long, long, long mouth could actually sort of stick that down way to the base of certain flowers and get the food out of them. And he called, or any sort of characteristic that made it more likely for an organism to be able to survive, to get enough food, to be able to outrun predators or do whatever. He called those things adaptations. And these were just sort of good traits that made it more likely for you to live. And he also saw that individuals could not change their own traits. So contrary to what Lamarck said, he saw that a species could adapt, that over time we could see changes in moths or giraffes, but that one individual could not adapt. An individual cannot change its own traits. So what was Darwin's idea? Why didn't he think that certain species could change over time? Well, according to him, what he thought here was that first, organisms were always competing against each other, no matter what kind of living thing it is. They're all competing each other for food, for water, for a place to live, for somebody to make babies with, that all organisms are always competing with one another, even within their own species. And that there are some individuals that have better traits that are going to be more likely to survive. And if you survive, then you reproduce. And if you reproduce, your DNA, your genes get passed on to the next generation. And so those traits that made you less likely to survive, if they don't get passed on to the next generation, we're probably going to see them less and less in a population. Not because the organism lost those traits, just because the organism with those traits died and didn't have babies. He comes up with this idea called survival of the fittest. And fitness is really the ability to survive and the ability to have kids. If an organism lives to be 200 years old but never has any offspring, those genes that made them live to be 200 years old die with them and they never get passed on to the next generation. So a fit organism is one that's able to live long enough to have kids, and those kids then can live long enough to have their own kids. He also comes up with this idea of natural selection, probably one of his most famous ideas that you've heard of before. And this idea is that nature selects traits that are good. Meaning if it could be good to be a white bear if you are a polar bear, right? If you live in an environment in which most of your environment is white, and so the white helps you blend in. But if you're a white tiger, chances are it's going to be harder for you to find something to eat because you don't blend into your background, versus the striped tiger definitely fits into its background a lot better. Or if you think of the case of the black bear versus a polar bear, black bears blend in a lot better in a forest and white bears would not. Occasionally, we do get albino tigers and albino bears like what you see here. But why don't we see more of them? Well, because these are bad traits, right? Most of the time, if these organisms were born in the wild with this coloration, they would not be likely to live long enough to survive and pass on those white genes to the next generation. Darwin also comes with this idea of descent with modification. To descent means we're just talking about from one generation to the next. And what he's saying is that from one generation to the next, we might see small differences in the traits that we see in a population of a species. So if we look at how horses look today compared to how horses looked thousands of years ago, they're a little bit different size. They are larger. They have different sort of shaped hooves. We definitely see some differences in the horses that we see today versus the fossil horses from the past. He also comes up with this idea of common descent, which is that the organisms that are living here today are related to the ones that have gone extinct. That those were sort of our common ancestors that we had a long, long time ago. Thank you for listening to Darwin's Influences, and I'll see you soon.